Yes, Mr. Herdman, besides the bridge case, you've been involved with the riots that broke out in 2020. The FBI lacked the familiarity with Antifa movement to see violence or new riots coming, something both Barr and Wolf warned about when they were secretaries. You've also seen threats from white racists, jihadists, and actors with anti-law enforcement ideologies. How do we ensure that the Department of Justice and the FBI are nimble and flexible, just enough to respond to threats of violence caused by different ideologies? And how varied is the domestic terrorism threat right now?
Thank you, Senator. Well, the bottom line is, if you're in federal law enforcement, you have to look at the conduct and the threat as it is being contemplated. So you look to the violent act, you look to the planning, and you look to the preparation. And frankly, the ideology matters far less when you're trying to disrupt a terrorism event than the actual conduct of the perpetrators. And it has to be that way. Now, ultimately at trial, that ideology or whatever is motivating that person to commit this act is important because it's motive evidence and it's something that you would want before the jury. But you have to have federal law enforcement postured to be able to identify and respond to actual conduct by individuals. And that requires well-trained agents and prosecutors. That requires close coordination with local law enforcement. That requires close coordination with communities, particularly vulnerable communities, like I mentioned in my testimony, the Jewish community among them, Muslims as well, a whole host of communities of color and ethnicity that are under threat. You have to be postured to be able to respond. And also, I would add, Senator, you have to be flexible in the way that you intake complaints. It's very important for federal law enforcement to be responsive to complaints from the public and to ensure that they are able to prioritize and respond to complaints that are brought to their attention.
Professor Turley, is it constitutional and prudential to direct executive branch officers to investigate in combating violence committed pursuant to some extremist ideology more than others?
I think that it is at best problematic. I actually think it does run afoul of separation of powers. I admit that this is that sort of gray area. Separation of powers is not hermetically sealed. There are overlaps between the executive and legislative. But I think this would not fare well in terms of trying to force a priority between individual cases. The Supreme Court has said over and over again, in the cases that I cite, in cases like Quinn, that even though this body itself has investigatory powers, it cannot intrude upon the choice of targets, development of cases, priorities given to particular areas by the executive branch. That's pretty consistent coming out of the Supreme Court in lower court cases. So that's the one flag that I threw on the act, and that I think that the Congress needs to really seriously consider that. As someone who represented one of the houses of Congress, the other house, in litigation, you know, one of the keys is that you don't want to go into litigation unless you have a fairly good idea of how you're going to come out, because you don't want to create precedent against your own institution. I would not view this as a very good course for this body, because I think that courts would look with disfavor on an effort to force the executive branch to prioritize particular types of cases within the category of terrorism.
Mr. Herdman, is it helpful to design executive branch offices around national security threats that exist today, or is it changing so rapidly that there's a benefit to flexibility?
I would always err in favor of flexibility, Senator. There are, in a moment's notice, the entire threat picture faced by federal law enforcement in the United States could change. It could change as a result of an international incident. It could change as a result of some domestic political event. And I think, you know, federal law enforcement has to be able to respond in a way that addresses the threat as it exists today, as opposed to what it was yesterday or what it was in preceding years. We just have to have that kind of flexibility from federal law enforcement.
Mr. Herdman, in your testimony, you noted many instances in which civilian communities, such as local Jewish community in Cleveland, were targets of attack. You formed strong partnerships to help you disrupt those threats. We're seeing that police are now increasingly becoming targeted for extremist violence. I've introduced a bill to gather more information on attacks on police. What else can we do to combat the rising tide of extremism, violence directed against the police?
Yeah, this is a real area of concern. Again, this is one of those things that does not depend on ideology. If somebody is willing to engage in a violent attack, they've almost always contemplated some sort of engagement with law enforcement. And that leads to, unfortunately, proactive planning by perpetrators when they are actually seeking out to kill, capture, kidnap law enforcement. So I would certainly be supportive of any federal effort to look into the incidents of terrorism directed at law enforcement. And I also certainly would be supportive of any federal measure that would seek to criminalize attacks that are made with the intent of killing law enforcement because of their status.